Hi everyone, my name is James Orme, editor at Techerati, and today we're delighted to be joined by CyrusOne's Matt Pullen, who is the managing director for Europe at the co-location provider. And today we're going to be discussing data center impact on IT spend and cloud acceleration seen since COVID-19. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt.
Welcome, James. Thanks for having me.
Now, what kind of growth did CyrusOne experience in its key markets, its witness in its key markets last year? And how is the trend developing in terms of new markets opening up, and how are you planning to move into them?
So currently CyrusOne operates in what are termed which are the tier one markets, but they're termed the flap D markets. That's Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. And last year, 2020, we saw a 50% increase in headline signings in those markets compared to 2019. And in aggregate, there was nearly 300 megawatts of headline signings. Cyrus represents about 8% of the capacity in those markets, and we had somewhat of an oversized share of the headline signings at around 20%, which was good. But I think the story that doesn't tell is that outside of the key markets, we're now seeing considerable growth as the hyperscalers open new regions in those markets. So places like Madrid, Milan, Zurich, and Warsaw all saw significant deployments representing a step change in market size, and naturally we're monitoring where the hyperscalers are opening new regions and looking to move into those new region markets.
And you mentioned some figures then about that reflected the growth in the top tier markets, tier one markets. Just give the viewers a sense of how that compared, let's say, to previous years.
I mean, bearing in mind that hyperscale demand is very what I'd call lumpy, because these days the average size of transactions has increased significantly. It's good really to look at the last 5 years. Really, 5 years ago, the hyperscale market started. That's been the latest evolution of the data center market. The previous two being, of course, the enterprise market post 9/11 and the telco boom market from 98 to 2000. Over the last 5 years, we've effectively seen a 15% average annual growth in the market. So in the flat D markets, the amount of co-location space has effectively doubled over 5 years. So you appreciate that when we see in 1 year a 50% increase in headline signings, that's going to stimulate significant growth beyond that average of 15% per annum.
Sure, and the sort of key word that we're mentioning again and again, not just in this conversation but everywhere, is acceleration. Growths have just speeded up, and accelerated the trajectories that the direction of travel that was already happening. And there was already concerns that in these top tier markets that this growth was going to raise some questions about sustainability. How long could it continue at this pace? With everything that's taken place over the last 12 months, what are these challenges looking like now? And what are some of the sort of innovations and conversations that need to be had in 2021 to ensure that we can sort of meet this demand and grow sustainably?
So let's start with the obvious challenge, which is COVID-19. Last year was a very, very difficult year in the face of the wall of demand that had been building pre-COVID and was accelerated as a result of COVID. So, the difficulties that beset the industry and indeed other industries with movement of goods and people. Also, you appreciate that you have to maintain manning levels on operational sites and manning levels on construction sites. And with social distancing and with the desire to keep everybody safe, inevitably manning levels are challenged, and therefore service delivery is challenged. The unexpected challenge last year was the ability to secure permits, be it occupancy permits, construction permits. Understandably, because of the dispensation that a lot of governments gave their departments and their local authority departments as it related to the normal timelines for accepting permit applications and determining permit applications, and that was quite unexpected. On the flip side, it's fair to say that all governments reacted very well to lobbying from in-country data center associations to the point around the essential / critical nature of data centers in the pandemic environment. And data centers generally were defined either as essential or critical, depending on which country, but that meant dispensation for us in terms of, the movement of goods and people and keeping construction sites open. Indeed, the only country that closed data center construction, and it was only for a period of 8 weeks, was Ireland in Dublin, and that was during the first lockdown. In subsequent lockdowns, data centers have been allowed to continue from a construction point of view. Outside of COVID, the challenges are in the major markets, the supply of land at a reasonable cost and the supply of power due to the constraints that the exponential demand, particularly from a power point of view, has put on some of the grids.
And what are some of the sort of technological innovations that are going to have to be introduced to sort of navigate these challenges around capacity and grid instability?
I think if you're talking about everyday people, we're looking at 5G obviously coming through, which is going to massively improve everyday people's experience when it comes to digital interface. Also, the advent of reasonable cost satellite internet will also help that. I think you've seen the industry react really well to support remote working. I mean, even the medium we're talking on today, and you've seen the exponential growth in demand, and that has led to growth in demand for capacity within facilities like ours to host these platforms, and the industry's responded well to delivering that new capacity. I think beyond that, what the pandemic has probably done is it's accelerated the focus on enterprise outsourcing to the cloud. And we've long held the view that the outsourcing of enterprise platforms to the cloud would sort of transcend any traditional outsourcing barriers that were put up often due to cultural issues in Europe. And so, we've seen exponential growth in markets across Europe, including those where you wouldn't normally see a rapid uptake in outsourced services. France, Spain, etc., being really good examples of that. So I do think we'll see much more rapid growth in enterprise outsourcing to the cloud than had been predicted pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about the accessibility and the ease of getting permits and the newly recognised status, if you like, in the UK of the importance of data centres and data centre service providers to the national economy. Is this going to have benefits that exceed or that surpass the current pandemic?
I think we've got to be careful on that point, because what comes with increased status is potentially beneficial, but also it can be a burden, particularly if it leads to rafts of legislation and red tape. So to be fair to the UK government, they are consulting actively with industry bodies and directly with industry companies, and to really look at what are the challenges that people like us face in growing and how they can help with those challenges. So there's been good discussions around the need for the power to become accelerated in terms of increased availability. Town and country planning in the UK, for example, is a streamlined approach needed for data centres to enable more rapid decision making, bearing in mind it's fairly evident where the physical growth of data centres in and around London needs to occur. So there is great dialogue going on, and to be honest, it's very similar, the dialogue in the European countries, not just around, if you like, day-to-day issues, but also longer term issues like sustainability and environmental regulation.
And what's the nature of customer visits and remote access with your tenants at present? I mean, obviously, I imagine you sort of put the wall down at the beginning. You sort of maybe introduce some sort of relaxing of the measures in summer. What's the customers currently looking to inspect sites? Are they able to visit? What measures have you put in place?
So it's a really interesting point. So at an operational level, as I mentioned before, you can't have an unmanned data center, and the data centers need to keep operating. So, our sites have been fully staffed by CyrusOne people and by customers people. We obviously had to introduce very stringent health and safety measures in the face of the pandemic. But that was relatively straightforward because, data centers are quite sort of regimented as environments, particularly from a security point of view, i.e. access point of view. So it was relatively straightforward to introduce, increased measures to carry out checks and just make sure that, the virus didn't make its way into our environments. Construction was more difficult, simply because social distancing isn't very easy on construction sites, particularly around data hall builds, pulling cables, etc. You can't do that being 2 meters apart. So the measures put in place there were stringent, but had to take into account far more multi-dimensional factors around social distancing. So from a customer point of view, the operations folk face the same issues that we did, needing to be on site. Commercial and other support functions have generally not visited sites. You would say, how on earth do you get 300 megawatts of signings done without people showing up, even at a commercial level, inspecting facilities? But the industry worked around that. I mean, we did virtual tours through the initial lockdown, and indeed throughout. Really, we haven't done a physical tour from memory since the beginning of the pandemic, because we just pivoted and we introduced technology to enable virtual tours. We had one yesterday in London, which was great. The use of drones, the use of all sorts of measures to enable our customers to have full visibility and virtual access to our sites.
Yeah, which really leads me to my next question, is what I guess a lot of people might be wondering, is what does this mean after COVID? Do facilities, or do customers really need to be as proximal to facilities anymore? Or is just the facilities proximal to links, network links, all that really matters?
Yeah, I think there's, there might be, I guess, some blurring of sort of thought on this, but from a working from home perspective, for example, I mean, what we're doing now, that's not really dependent on the data center being close to you, or close to you and I, because these aren't terribly latency sensitive things. Yes, you see people experiencing problems, but that's generally as it relates to their own wireless connection, as opposed to the latency that's inherent in the platform that they're using. It becomes much more relevant when you get into the enterprise level, and as you know, there's some very latency critical things that go on, particularly in financial trading. And that is why data centers generally follow GDP. They need to be in urban and suburban areas, because at the end of the day, light only travels at the speed of light, and it can't travel any faster. And on low latency critical applications, you need proximity, and it will always be the case.
Now, moving on to a recent development in terms of the sustainability agenda for the data center sector. CyrusOne was a signatory to the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, which was signed earlier this year. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Pact and what it's trying to achieve, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes back to the fact that the industry is so young, relatively, and somewhat misunderstood. What I just talked about in terms of the need for data centers to follow GDP and be in urban and suburban areas is absolutely the case. And I think if you're not careful, policymakers can, quickly, without knowledge, reach a conclusion, for example, that perhaps data centers should be in the locations where you could easily get green power. So in Europe, that would be, the Nordics for hydro, the Baltics for wind, and Southern Europe for solar. But the reality is they can't be, because they have to be in urban and suburban areas in the major economies and the cities that drive those economies. And so the point of the data center pact is that we wanted to get to a position where we could discuss openly with Brussels in particular, a self-regulatory approach whereby we acknowledged the need for data centers to become more efficient and to have less impact on the planet. But because of the perceived complexity and the lack of understanding of our industry, we wanted to be able to put forward our proposals, both in terms of the actions and the timelines associated with those, to deliver against sustainable targets. And at the end of the day, it's fair to say that it's in our customers' interest that we become more and more and more efficient, because that means that we're in effect lowering the cost to our customers of our capacity. And also, our customers are some of the biggest enterprise companies on the planet, and they themselves have very, very, very aggressive targets towards sustainability, and they want us to contribute to those targets for them. So it's pretty self evident that by forming this pact, 25 companies, that we felt we would deliver more results for the planet quicker than if we all just operated independently and waited to be subjected to regulation.
And what do you say to those who challenge the self-regulatory aspect nature of the pact, and also point to some of the more substantive claims around sort of water reuse? We promised to take a look at investigating ways to reuse water rather than actually reusing wastewater. What is your response to people who raise those challenges?
Sympathy. I can understand that people want to see data centers and the components that we use in data centers, like diesel generators. People see them as offensive to the planet, and they want to see a more rapid movement to not needing certain components. I get that completely. The flip side is, and I've heard people within and around the industry be quite blunt, which is, that's fine. If you don't want a smartphone, then fine. We'll be in less demand and there'll be less impact on the planet. So if you want to give up your smartphone, then you won't have so many diesel generators. But that's not constructive. The constructive approach is for the big hyperscalers and the co-location providers to work together to an agenda that does deliver long-term sustainability. Your point on water is interesting, and an issue that we've faced, which is that there are cooling systems that use water that dramatically reduce the PUE, the power utilization efficiency, and create a far more, on the top line, sustainable data center, but with water usage that is now under scrutiny. And so what we're doing is we're trying to adapt and advance cooling technologies so that water is no longer critical in achieving those ultra low PUEs. Again, in response to obvious concerns about water usage across the planet.
And what's your roadmap at CyrusOne, particularly over the next 5 years? What are some of your big goals that you're hoping to achieve in terms of sustainability, strides you're going to make in that area?
So we've come out, and we're quite unique in doing it, and said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2040, and that's across the globe. We have less challenges in Europe, I think, because of heightened sensitivity for quite some time. So, for example, we will be using 100% renewables from a power point of view by the end of this year in Europe. To be honest, by the end of last year, we were nearly there, and we're just putting in place contracts now which will ensure that we meet that target. We benefit at Cyrus from having a much newer portfolio in Europe than we do in the US. Therefore, we've been able to incorporate quite efficient infrastructure because of the relative age of the portfolio. In the US, our big target is to effectively repurpose aging facilities with newer technologies to drive down PUEs and drive down, drive out inefficiencies from a sustainability point of view. The big challenge for the industry is what I mentioned, the diesel generators, and where do we go with that? And the view is that we'll move to hydrogen. The challenge is cost and the capability of technology that's available today. And to be honest, that's why we need to work with Brussels so closely from a European point of view, because we really need to look at some form of national and regional hydrogen grid infrastructure that will support the data centers, rather than relying on each operator to try and figure out more localized solutions to something that's much more of a national, regional, global issue.
Yeah, and lastly, it's interesting you mentioned hydrogen, because obviously the big story last year was Microsoft's project to sort of ease its dependency on diesel generators, and they're looking to switch to hydrogen. Now, am I not mistaken, or were they a noticeable absentee from the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, or are they getting involved?
No, but and apologies if I got this wrong. My understanding is that the big three hyperscalers are part of the 25. Yeah,
that must be me that's got it wrong. Well, thanks so much for chatting through that with us, Matt. It was great to talk to you. I'm aware we haven't got much time, so we're going to leave it there. But thanks very much for talking to Techerati, and I hope to have you on the program again.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity.